All right, 2 Kings 16 is where we are. The thermostat says that the air is on, but I don't believe it. And Scott thinks the same as well, so it's not just a me thing. So I never can tell. Some people ask, is it warm in here or cold in here? I'm never a good gauge of that. So 2 Kings 16, we are looking at tonight King Ahaz, and Ahaz reigns in Judah. And if I call him Jotham, and for some reason today, as I've looked through this, I've thought Jotham the whole time. I wrote Jotham in notes. I did all kinds of things. So just know we're talking about Ahaz. If I say Jotham, I really mean Ahaz. Jotham has passed away. Ahaz is his son taking over for him. Now, these two chapters, 2 Chronicles 28, Isaiah 7, we'll look at them a little bit. There are some things that can be confusing when you get into 2 Chronicles 28, trying to work out the timeline with what it says and 2 Kings 16. We're going to try to avoid that tonight, not because there's not answers to it, but because, it doesn't really change what we're studying and moving us down the line. So there will be this, and then Isaiah 7, of course, is known for the Emmanuel passage that's quoted in Matthew 1, Jesus being born of a virgin and his name being called Emmanuel, which being interpreted as God with us. And so that prophecy will have background in what we're going to look at tonight. All right. Now you remember we have been through some, I think in chapter 15, verse 23, when we met Pekahiah, and then Pekah, and then Jotham. We talked about how from this point forward, you're either going to be a king that is pro-Assyrian or anti-Assyrian. Oh, there's my hand. Okay, so everybody's going to fall into one of those two, and at least while Israel stands. When it comes to Judah, it will turn into, are you pro-Babylon, pro-Egypt, something along those lines, but we'll deal with that when we cross that bridge. All right, 16, let's look at 1 through 4 to begin with. It says, in the 17th year of Pekah, the son of Remaliah, Ahaz, the son of Jotham, king of Judah, began to reign. Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. And he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord his God, as his father David had done, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. He even burned his son as an offering, according to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. And he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Okay? So we've had some kings that weren't so bad. We've had a pretty good succession of them. Now, by the way, this is kings in the south now. This is what we call Judah. So we left off last week, we were looking at kings in the north, that succession of kings that murdered each other. Now we're back to the south looking at King Ahaz. And so we've had a pretty good run of kings in the south. They weren't necessarily the most righteous kings in the world, but they weren't really bad either. Okay? As a matter of fact, the statement that's attached to them is they were faithful to the Lord God, the God of Israel, as their fathers had been. Not as David. That's kind of the ultimate expression. When it says you were faithful as David was, it means you didn't engage in idolatry and you would not allow idolatry to exist with your knowledge under your reign. And some of the previous kings refused to engage in idolatry, kept the temple open, but they also didn't put away idolatry from their midst. And so they're kind of this, God speaks favorably of them, but not to the same degree that he does some of the others. Excuse me. Now, in this particular setting, if you look at the Chronicles, 2 Chronicles 28, which we won't, there's one statement that's added to this. So, well, let's back up just a second. So in the 17th year of Pekah, he begins to reign. He's 20 years old. He reigns 16 years in Jerusalem. And so he does what's evil in the sight of the Lord, but he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. And then in 2 Chronicles, you can look in the first, probably 4 or 5 verses, it says that he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, but he also built altars to the Baals, okay, which is not mentioned here. And then he made his son to pass through the fire. Now, that's significant because when we were here, Elijah and Elisha's ministry was focused on one thing, and that was stamping out Baal worship. And it was gone in chapter 11 and chapter 12. It was disappeared. Now it's reappearing again. Okay? And so they're introducing this idolatry. And the reason that the word Baals is plural is because Baal was kind of like an overarching term. And then you had kind of a whole pantheon of different gods of fertility that went along with that particular worship. So, in this context, he says he walked in the ways, verse 3, of the kings of Israel. Now, the only other king up to this date in Judah that is characterized this way was Joram, King Joram, in chapters past. And you can look at the chart and go and find all the information about him. So he's engaging in idolatry the way that they did. And then it says he even burned his son as an offering. Notice the use of the word even. It's an emphatic term. And if you watch it throughout Old and New Testaments, it's pretty consistent. For an example, when Paul is exalting the sacrifice of Jesus, it says he became obedient to the point of death even. It wasn't just point of death, that is, any death. It was even the death on the cross. And so the fact that he's using the word even, sometimes these little words are what transform entire meanings. And what he's trying to communicate is he went even further, and he burned his son as an offering. Now, in this book, we've already seen some of that, okay? If you back up to 2 Kings 3 and verse 27, you remember they went to war, and the king of a foreign nation sacrificed his son, and the Israelites just withdrew, okay? Also, in other places, we'll see it happen again in the future. But this was something that was forbidden under the old law. Long before they went into the promised land, long before any king was ever ordained, God told them not to participate in this. Most likely who this is Chemosh, the god of the Ammonites. Now, the Ammonites are descendants of, you remember, Lot's incestuous relationship with Abraham, the Moabites and the Ammonites. Chemosh is this god, and Manasseh is going to be really enamored with him, and we'll see him a little bit later in the book. So there were certain levels of dedication and worship, okay? And so the highest level of commitment, I think some have said that there are 7. I haven't done all the fact checking on that, so I'll go with it. It may or may not be completely accurate. But there are 7 levels of sacrifice and offering that you make to Chemosh. And the highest level is to take your child and to burn him as an offering, okay? Now, what that would involve is you kind of have a molten statue with his arms outstretched and a fire that was heating those arms. And then I would imagine probably something in the middle, because I don't think the child could stay still, just resting on 2 outstretched arms, especially with what's taking place. And there the child would be consumed. And it's as disgusting as it sounds. These are fertility gods. This was a way to supposedly get the God's attention and show your commitment to him so that he would bless the ground and your farms and things along those lines. God speaks of this practice a lot through Jeremiah. And when he uses Jeremiah, he says, this stuff never entered my heart. I never, ever, ever, excuse me, intended for this. This is the highest level of abomination, is for us to offer our children and sacrifice to these gods. And so when we read about a king in Judah doing that, he's not just given to idolatry, he's sold out to idolatry. All right? He is completely sold out. And he's one of the first kings to really be pro-idolatry since Solomon. Solomon also worshipped Chemosh and some of the others, 1 Kings 11. And so what this symbolizes is, we can look at it and we can say, well, there's all this random information. Yeah, but if you take a higher view of what's going on, all this random information really isn't random. It's painting the digression of the nation, rise and ruin, okay? And the thing is, with sin in general, and Romans 1 is probably the best way, Romans 1, 18 to 32 is probably the best text to go through to illustrate that. We won't go through it now, but so sin starts kind of small here, but with sin, some people call sin, you progress in sin. Sin is not progression, sin is digression, okay? Progression is righteousness, digression is sin. You're going backwards, okay? So it starts small, and then it continues to get bigger and bigger and spiral and spiral and spiral and spiral and atrocity after atrocity. And that's what we're looking at. That's what we're seeing here in 16, is that this thing has gotten just ridiculous. They are so far removed from what God wanted them to be. He strictly spoke against this practice before they entered the land. Now they're doing it. They're offering their sons in the fire, and he even attaches this to it. According to the despicable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. This is exactly what the people who lived in the promised land before them were doing. And now they're doing it. Which, by the way, reminds us of the fact that God used Israel to punish these people. God didn't just give them this land because he said, hey, I like Israel better than I like you, and I want them to have the land and not you. As a matter of fact, he said he couldn't do that. That's Genesis 15, a discussion with Abraham. He said the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet full. They haven't reached that level yet. I wouldn't be just if I gave you their land. But because they did garbage like this, that's why God sent Israel to punish them. And because Israel and Judah do garbage like this, God is going to send Assyria and Babylon to punish them. And the thing that is scary about this is that every one of us are capable of these digressions. Every one of us. So, in one of my history classes in school, we had to read a book called Ordinary Men, I think. It was about a group of Polish men that were involved in the final solution in Nazi Germany. And the reason why they were chosen was because there was more testimony from them, so you could kind of examine what was going on. And I had always kind of wondered in my own mind how the people involved in the final solution justified what they did. Not the higher ups, I get them brainwashed and just completely lost in anything but reality. But the guys on the ground, the guys that actually had to do it, how did they bring themselves to do it? And this book examines that whole question and does so very well. But the point and the reason the book is called Ordinary Men is these were men who were too old to enlist in the German army. And so they were used in this way. Okay? And so you had ordinary men, and they were being told to execute people that they worked with on a regular basis, to take them outside of the city and to have them kneel down on their knees in front of the mass grave, and they taught them exactly how to put the gun to the back of their head to kill them and execute them. People say, how is that possible? How do you justify that? Well, the basic premise of the trials at Nuremberg was we had orders and we followed them. The group of ordinary men that were examined, that Polish unit, I think the 101st unit, they said, well, when they did it, the Nazis had to basically keep them drunk to make them do it. And force them to party a lot afterward, anything to keep them from thinking about what they were doing. Now, what's interesting is, in the course and the thought of that book, is that when they were involved with the actual executions, they really struggled with it morally. They really did. They did it, but they struggled with it. But when they were reassigned as a unit to simply be the ones who loaded the trains that sent them to execution camps, their consciences were much more eased because in their mind, they weren't pulling the trigger. Well, and again, you and I both know that's a very debatable question. People say, you can't do that. That had to be because, they were ignorant and, brainwashed. Listen, this is what most people don't realize about what happened in World War II, and it ought to really sober us up. The German nation was the most educated nation on the planet in World War II. There was no nation more educated than them. And that's why a lot of people have come to the conclusion that the concentration camps weren't built in locations. They were built in classrooms a generation before as they trained them to think that way. People say, we could never do that. If I look at something sinful and say, I could never do that, I don't really understand what sin can do to a person. All of us are capable of untold evil if it's not checked or harnessed. Because sin, when you play with it, will digress you. You see, it kills the whole point. And that's why Paul says in Hebrews 3, or whoever wrote Hebrews 3 and verse 13, to exhort one another daily, lest anyone be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Sin doesn't knock on your door and say, you know what, I'm going to get you to kill someone today. But it starts by cutting one little nerve at a time. One sin at a time. And then another one. Then another one. So it's progressive in the sense that you don't really notice it. You just keep taking baby steps and taking baby steps and taking baby steps. The problem is you take baby steps long enough and you turn around and you realize how far you've wandered away. So when we look at their story, and that's what Paul is saying in Romans 1, it's really the story of all of us, of what we're able to do. And what is happening here is you see a king who's leading, and when he's leading and he embraces this type of thinking, he's going to pour it down upon his people, and it's going to become very common for them as well. The king's job as God's magistrate was to restrain the people. What happens when the person responsible for restraining them embraces what they do and embraces what they should restrain? That's what's happening, okay? So verse 4, he sacrificed and made offerings on the high places and on the hills and under every green tree. Again, this is where idolatry was practiced. Under every green tree, you have to remember that these are fertility cults. And fertility, by fertility, I don't mean the fertility to have a child. I mean the fertility of the ground. They're agricultural societies. Now, with that being said, sexual perversion was a very big part of their, quote, worship. Okay? It was considered an act of worship. And they would do that on these high places and under green trees and offer their sacrifices and engage in a perversion. So, Ahaz does not start out well. Then in verse 5, we see an alliance of kings come against him. It says in verse 5, then Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, the king of Israel, that's the northern tribes, came up to wage war on Jerusalem, and they besieged Ahaz but could not conquer him. Okay, if you hold your finger there, Isaiah 7 gives us, a little bit of detail here. Isaiah 7 in verse 2 says that when they came, it says, when the house of David was told, Syria is in league with Ephraim, which is another term used to describe Israel in the north. The heart of Ahaz and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. They were scared to death. Okay? Then we're told basically why they're coming. In verses 5 and 6 of Isaiah 7, this was their plan. Because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah had devised evil against you, saying, let us go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up the son of Tabiel as the king in the midst of it. And so what you have then is in control in Israel at the time, okay? So our kings that are coming are, so you've got Pekah, and Pekah is anti-Assyria. And then you've got Rezin from Syria, and he's also anti-Assyrian. Then you've got Ahaz, and he's pro-Assyrian. Now you've got to remove from your minds the thought of the way world politics work today. You don't negotiate things. You rule by force. If there's a king up and you don't like him, you kill him. And you replace him with somebody you like. So, what they're doing and what Isaiah is talking about in chapter 7, verses 5 and 6 is this. So these two kings are together with Israel and Syria because they're anti-Assyrian. They don't want Assyria to rise because they live pretty close to their borders. So these men come against Ahaz because Ahaz is pro-Assyrian. And so what they want to do is knock Ahaz off and set up Tabiel. And I may be spelling his name right, I may not, I don't know. They want to set him up because he will be anti-Assyrian. And so what they think they're doing is strengthening their coalition. Okay? Now, there's also another reason that the Chronicles brings out, and that is that God is making all this happen because Ahaz was so idolatrous. God is using this against them to punish Ahaz. So, verse 6, it says, at that time, Rezin, the king of Syria, recovered Elath for Syria. Now, Elath had just been recovered in chapter 14 and verse 22 to Israel. But he conquers it back for Syria and drove the men of Judah from Elath, and the Edomites came to Elath where they dwell to this day. So Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and rescue me from the hand of the king of Syria and from the hand of the king of Israel who are attacking me. Okay? So, Ahaz sees them coming. He's not gone, and because he's pro-Assyrian, he says, let's go to Assyria and ask him for help. Okay? Here's the problem. Somebody read for us Exodus 23:22. Exodus 23:22. This is in the giving of the law. Okay? God was telling them that he was going to protect them. They didn't need, God told them from the beginning, you don't need international diplomacy. You don't need international relations. If you will be faithful to me, you won't need any of that. I'm your protection. Okay? And that's why the prophets will spend a lot of time talking about this, Isaiah and Jeremiah in particular. They will spend time preaching against them because they want to run to Assyria, or they want to run to Babylon, or they want to run to Egypt to get protection, instead of acknowledging they've sinned and running to God and asking God to protect them. And when they do run to God and ask him to protect them, he does. That's 2 Kings 18 and 19, which we'll get to in a little bit with King Hezekiah and the Assyrians. He kills 185,000 of them in a night. So what we're seeing then is a byproduct of his idolatry. That's why he's trying to negotiate things. He's trying to fix things on his own. And as we've said many times before, I think we see ourselves in that. We try to fix things and fix things and fix things instead of taking them to where they're supposed to be going. So that's his situation, and he appeals to Tiglath-Pileser. And verse 8, it says, Ahaz took the silver and gold that was found in the house of the Lord and in the treasuries of the king's house and sent them as a present to King Assyria. This has happened before. It's going to continue to happen again. They're going to keep buying protection from other nations. And to do that, they take things out of the temple that belong to God. It's another earmarker or a bold statement saying they're walking away from me further and further. They're getting further and further away from me. It's not just here to say they bought protection with the stuff of the temple. It's here to say they're getting further and further away from me. As he would say through Hosea, I taught them how to walk, and all they do is run away from me. I'm the one who loved them. I'm the one who took care of them. And they don't want anything to do with me. Verse 9, and the king of Assyria listened to him, and the king of Assyria marched up against Damascus, which is the capital of the nation of Syria, and took it, and took its people captive to Kir, and he killed Rezin, the king of Syria. Based on some statements made in Amos 1:5 and Amos 9:7, Kir is where the people of Syria originally came from. They later settled, similar to the Philistines. They lived on an island, and then they came and settled on the coast of the Promised Land, and several others also in that process. So they took them and resettled them back in their original land. And now he's going to take another step in the wrong direction. When King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, he saw the altar that was at Damascus. What particular altar it is, it does not say. It may have been one mentioned in chapter 5 and verse 18 when we met Naaman, and he was asking Elisha what to do when he was called to go and worship a pagan god now that he had been converted. And King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest a model of the altar and its pattern, exact in all its details. And Uriah the priest built the altar in accordance with all that Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it before King Ahaz arrived from Damascus. Now Uriah the priest made an altar to worship a false god. Descendant of Aaron, priesthood, guarded. Malachi will say in his writings in Malachi chapter 2 that the job of the priests and the Levites was to guard the law. Even if the kings won't guard it, the priests should guard it. And now you have a man responsible for guarding the law, welcoming idolatry into the house of God. The king came from Damascus. The king viewed the altar. Then the king drew near to the altar and went up on it. And he burned his burnt offering and his grain offering and poured his drink offering and threw the blood of his peace offering on the altar. And the bronze altar that was before the Lord he removed from the front of the house, from the place between his altar and the house of the Lord, and he put it on the north side of the altar. So now they're starting to rearrange furniture. Now the temple that is set apart to worship God is now going to become a place where you can worship idols. You can do whatever you want to do. So you've got the temple precinct, you've got the most holy place, and the holy place, and the altar that's here, directly in front of it where you sacrifice. He moves it out of the way and brings an idol in. They're replacing God. Now again, some people look at this and say, yawn, what's the big deal here? What's that got to do with us? Because people are doing it right now. God no longer is the focus of worship. It's my feelings. It's my entertainment. It's you better perform the right way, and you better meet my needs. You're taking God and setting him to the side, backstage, and putting yourself on the front stage. Now, you may not be physically moving anything. That's what makes it all the more easy for us to do it. But we do the same thing. And so when we're looking at these people in the Old Testament, look, people look at them and they say, how could they be so ignorant? You're looking at yourself. I'm looking at myself. God no longer is central because, okay, let's pause if we want to think about furniture for a minute. Why is this pulpit, and why are all pulpits in every location in the center of a church building? For design reasons? No. They are here because the church has always believed that the preaching of the Word of God was central to the life of the church. And to illustrate that, they put the pulpit in the center. People say, well, the pulpit's still in the center. Yes, the piece of furniture may be. But the people who fill the pulpits have taken God out of the center of it. Let me meet your needs and let me make sure you feel well. And if God can get a word in edgewise, we might do that too. So we can sleep on this information, or we can hammer it pretty hard. Because it's the picture of what we're doing. The king said to Ahaz, verse 15, and King Ahaz commanded Uriah the priest, saying, offer the great altar, on the great altar, burn the morning burnt offering and the evening grain offering and the king's burnt offering and his grain offering, and with the burnt offering of all the people of the land and their grain offering and their drink offering, and throw it and all the blood of the burnt offering on, and all the blood of the sacrifice. But the bronze altar shall be for me to inquire by. Uriah the priest did as King Ahaz commanded him. So now he's not just removed it and said that we're going to offer our daily sacrifices, which were required by the law. We're going to now use God's altar that's been moved. That's where I'm going to perform divination. We're going to cut open an animal and we're going to look at its intestines, its entrails, and we're going to discern what we should do based upon that. So a thing that was meant to bring reconciliation between God and his people has now come a thing to try and discern what other gods say? And some people look at this and say, you get kind of agitated about this. You should. Look who God is. Who in the world do we think we are? Raising our hand against God and using things that he devised to bring us to himself to go after other gods. That's why the prophets, when they preach and when they teach, that's why the whole of their being is thrown into what they're saying. Because it's like they're looking at it and they just can't believe it. And you know what? To a degree, I know where they're coming from. Because I can sit and I can look at what goes on sometimes, and I just can't believe what I'm seeing. I call those my Nick Saban moments, where he explodes out on the field. That's when I go in a room by myself and close the door, and I just have my moment of frustration. Listen, we're dealing with God. This is a big deal. He's going to take it even further. He doesn't like the design of some of the things in the temple, so now he's going to do some more things. So King Ahaz cut off the frames of the stands and removed the basin from which he took down the sea from off the bronze oxen that were under it and put it on a stone pedestal, that big laver that you could wash in. It was resting upon cows or bulls? What is it? Oxen. And it was resting on top of them. And so he just cuts that off and decides to put the bowl on something else. And he covered the way of the Sabbath that had been built inside the house, and the outer entrance for the king he caused to go around the house of the Lord because of the king of Syria. And so he reroutes the entrance into the palace so that he doesn't have to intersect with the temple anymore. So why does he do that? Listen, when you know you're wrong, you don't want anything reminding you that you're wrong. And the easiest thing to do is to avoid it. And so, if you don't like the way a person points out the things that are sinful, what do? You send him packing down the road. You don't like this particular scenario, you avoid it because it reminds you of your sinfulness. So even Ahaz, in the midst of his idolatry, his conscience is still getting it. There's something that God placed inside of us, and we can try and kill it all day long, but it's there. And I've had conversations with people who would basically yell at the top of their lungs to me, what I'm doing is not wrong. And my question to them is always this: who are you trying to convince, me or you? That's what Ahaz is doing. So we'll pick up, you can read the end of that. It's a typical ending. And then we'll move into 17, and that's the end. That will be the end of Israel as a nation, the 10 northern tribes.